Well, good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is NycosRPG. Welcome to Nykos. Today we're going to be taking a retrospective kind of story. I'm calling it The Long Way Round. I'm going to walk through several different snippets of adventures that have happened through the last 50 years and how they can impact you as a games player yourself, and in particular if you are a game master, what kind of things you might expect in the evolution of your game. Before we do that, make sure you go down below and click all the buttons to let the algorithm know you're part of our audience, and let's go.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so welcome to Nykos. This is going to be a rather extended episode. I'm not planning any particular start time, stop times, and I'm not particularly focusing on any particular nuance of role-playing, but instead kind of a vignette of the way things have gone over the last 50 years. Each of these is just a short snippet, but they will include some actual stories from the games that I've run. Those of you that are my players will find perhaps some Easter egg information, but generally I'm going to be speaking at the top line, talking about how roleplay itself has evolved over time. Well, that one's got the wrong type at the top. Ignore that part. So we're going to go with the second part, which is the Run What You Brung. Dungeons & Dragons, as a game mechanism, originally focused on the concept of creating a character at random and then playing that character to the best of its abilities with its limitations and number variances. Initially, it was a generation system that used 3d6. You rolled them in a specific sequence, and the numeric values would be what you would operate. Now, back in those days also, the races, especially drag races, would use the phrase RWYB, or Run What You Brung. The idea is that you didn't modify your car, you didn't do anything special to it, you just showed up and they had you race against all the other types of vehicles that might be there. So you might end up with a V8 against a 4-cylinder straight. You might run into a 3-speed automatic against a 4-speed stick shift. And the idea here was that the general characteristics of your vehicle were partially important, but also your skill as a driver. And so therefore it was thought to be a more fair measure of equity. And they would do it based on, I believe, like pink slip prices. So generally numbers that were in the same area would be used. Now this concept of Run What You Brung was really heavy in roleplay as well, because you theoretically, if you were a good role player, in theory at least, you would be able to overcome your negative numbers by ensuring that the situations that you got yourself into didn't depend on dice rolls very often. And when you did, then there was that moment of stroke of luck. And so therefore, if you had a character that had only moderate values, if you were an exceptional role player, you would be able to avoid any of the conflicts that would be dependent upon the dice rolls. Now, this wasn't very popular in terms of players. Game Master didn't particularly care. A story is a story, and the characters that you have at your table only matter in terms of what they can accomplish. But players, on the other hand, were very unhappy with this mechanism. So it didn't take long. As a matter of fact, within the first couple of years, you started to have the various, as we've talked about before, the various house rules becoming canon. The idea of using 4d6 and discarding a value to give you a better average, rolling 6 dice for your attributes and then picking the order in which you place them, and then add to that the amplification of the differences in species into modifiers, and therefore you could fundamentally adjust your min-maxed numbers to get precisely what you wanted. Now it got far, far worse over time, so that by the time you get to 3.5 and Pathfinder, you now have a packet of feats that can be accentuated to therefore drive your persona exactly to what you want. And we'll talk more about that in a later slide. But the idea here is that the run what you brung mechanism was only overshadowed because the pressure for players to be perfect started to arrive. And that was really not the case, at least initially. It was, let's tell the story with what characters we have, and the brutality that now has resurged in OSR games really are a throwback to that more volatile form of character building. As a matter of fact, some of the newer mechanisms that have been coming out, Mothership and the like, have pretty much adjusted the mechanism so that the dice rolling is less important and the sheer lethality of the opponents that you face are the real triggers on what makes the game challenging or interesting. Alrighty, so another challenge in role-playing games, especially when you're reconsidering my start age. At the age of 11 and 12 and 13, the stories that I was telling were pretty vanilla, pretty simplistic, and taking into account that the people that I had to play the games with were, for example, my little sister. And when you're 11 and your sister is 9, naturally the stories can't go very dark. And when things get scary or dangerous and the dice roll where they are and the character receives damage, it didn't take long for my little sister to go running to my parents to complain. Now, from a GM standpoint, if a character makes a stupid decision and you verify that that's all they want to do, then you fundamentally have to present them with the negatives and that the chips fall where they may. Well, in this case, my sister going to my parents led at one time to my dad coming and stepping into the room saying, "Jonathan, whatever just happened in the game, you got to fix it." And so "fix it, Jonathan" became a real common phrase in those days because there were a lot of times when I was testing and challenging different parts of the adventure to get the players to be in those vulnerable, volatile situations that my sister would go running. And so, yes, "fix it, Jonathan" was a mechanism. I had to simply learn how to, what now we would call retcon, how to redefine the outcome in a more favorable way. I do have to say that there's a really interesting product if you ever got a chance to see it, and I'll be doing a review on it in the next week or so, called No Thank You Evil. It's been out for a short period of time. I don't have all the details sitting in front of me. I do think I have a copy of it right here. Yes, Monty Cook Games. You can't see it in my invisible wall of my bookshelf, but back there, 5 rows on the left-hand side, Monty Cook's No Thank You Evil. But the mechanism in that game particularly allows for actually requires the idea of retcon, that the players can invoke a No Thank You Evil token. This is too dangerous or too stressful. I can't accommodate it, so can you please change the story? And that's built in. So we'll deal with that in a while. But the point is that the concept of "fix it, Jonathan" really does lead, at least myself as a game master, to the concept of having open story interpretation so that there can be instantaneously retconned situations as necessary. Another challenge of role-play games, starting from the beginning, was the idea of extending a player character's life. As defined, the hit points of a character were its life force, and when that number is reduced to 0, the character is kaput. The character is dead, and the story now has to reconcile that eliminated person from the story. And it didn't take very long for players to get very concerned with this, because they liked the character that they developed. They'd grown an affinity for it. And especially as they started to go into the modification where you could make your numbers what you wanted them to be so that you got to play precisely the character you wanted, the idea of a character's life being over at 0 hit points became a difficulty. And homebrews came out of the woodworks. There were a couple of different sort of half-hearted attempts by products like Judges Guild and such that would give a buffer point. Like, for example, you could fight all the way to your to the life points of 0, but if you had a high constitution, then theoretically that +1, +2, +3 could be pressed onwards, so therefore you could actually, at a very high constitution, be like Conan, able to take abuse that should have killed you and still keep moving, and therefore you got to have a higher point value. The threshold switched from 0 to minus the constitution modifier. So if you had a constitution of 17 and you had a +3, then that +3 would be able to increase how long you could stay alive all the way down to 3 hit points negative. And this was all well and good. Early on, players were from a sophisticated mindset that understood the number line and therefore understood that negative value. But as time became more difficult, then it became not just the +3, but it became up to a +10. So you could go negative to a -9 hit points and still survive, as long as somebody could care for you immediately. And then that got pushed again to the minus of the constitution. And in my games, for the majority of the time that I was a game master throughout the second edition into the third and even into what later became the fourth edition period, which there's only one mechanism that I didn't play but once. But the idea of having a value equal to your negative constitution meant that you could survive longer. And it was always understood that once that happened, you would be taking months to get those points back, that the story would have to alter because you were in such a grave state. But the concept of extending PC life was the resolution. Now you move forward into later versions of Dungeons and Dragons, and all of a sudden you've got the death saves that came out with a 5th edition. The idea of having a 3 strikes method to keep you from dying, and ties go to the runner, so you always had a little bit of an edge on it, meant that your likelihood of character elimination almost vanished. And I've even seen articles and discussions with different game masters and RPG influencers arguing that there shouldn't be character death, that instead the character should be able to extend themselves beyond those points, and therefore the game master, it's almost a requirement nowadays that you negotiate with your players in advance of their demise, so they are aware of it and make the actual conscious decision to allow their characters to end. Now, there's more to that than I want to go into right now. We'll do an entire video on that later, but the idea that the extension of a PC's existence was required in storytelling because adventures, by their necessity, needed to be lethal, but you had to have ways to allow the characters to overcome that lethality, and extending the hit point mechanism was really the only way. So next we're going to talk about the influence of movies. And to be honest, when you're an 11-year-old game master, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, pop culture is absolutely important, and the stories that you tell are by necessity going to be influenced by the things that you see, the movies and the TV shows and all of that. And in this case, the idea of being influenced by movies not only included direct influence, such as my players deciding that they wanted to run around an adventure as the only mortals on the planet, led to the idea of running it sort of as a Planet of the Apes proto-story. The second thing is that the Hollywood was aware of the concept of taglines. If you had something that was clever or charming or instrumental in a movie, you wanted to have a tagline associated with it so that the players would grab a hold of that information. When it wasn't for the play, it wasn't like they were doing it for role play, but it was an absolute mechanism that a warrior, when he would come into a situation, find himself in a threatened situation, would look around and then say, "I'll be back." These movie tags highly influenced play because characters could identify themselves with a character in a movie simply by quoting that character. And yes, the stories of a young Jonathan were those stories that I saw in movies, but I'll go into how that particularly works, but the idea is that the stories that you tell become your way of expressing the things that you've seen in the films so that the players can feel their own part of that story in that same venue and accept the world that they're in and embrace the identity of who they are playing and perhaps tying them to movie characters. Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about is the influence of players having access to the materials of a game master. Camera's freaking out on me. Sorry about that. Get a little bit closer to me, that'll help. So in the early, this would be in the mid-70s, early 80s, my players were becoming more and more sophisticated. Many of them arguably had better paying jobs than I did, so to speak, and would have access to all of the written materials. So a player will have already had the DM's guide and the monster manual, and so therefore not only know what rules you're going to be playing with against them, but a clear understanding of every monster in the book. And so before the Dungeons and Dragons extended their monster manual to include more and more monsters that were coming in through the concepts of the D20 and new moderate versions of them. Before the Monsters Compendium was published, I had already created that as a term. Now, granted, I now call it the Enchiridion, but the idea is that I redefined every monster in the game. Man, that is really, that's messed up today. I don't know what that issue is. But the idea is that the monsters in the book, if I use them as described, the players would immediately know what the counteraction to their special abilities were and what their weaknesses would be. The most obvious example is the concept of the troll. Dungeons and Dragons defined them relatively quickly as having a vulnerability to fire, and in particular, without that, they had the ability to regenerate. And so by using a weapon that did fire damage, you reduced that ability for the troll to come back from the dead, so to speak. So by renaming, I mean, this is the year 1978, 1979. I literally rewrote the entire monster manual from A to Z, so to speak, and redefined every creature in new ways so that they were not identifiable. The concept of a troll became, you had to look at that from a standpoint of vagueness. Is it a hairy troll? Is it a scaled troll? And so on. But I also amplified the different creature types and modified them so that they were indistinguishable. Now, the advantage is that by doing so, I removed most of the monstrous continuum, so to speak, from the Dungeons and Dragons mechanism altogether, obviating any worry about copyright infringement or anything in terms of the materials that I would produce. But even with that, the idea is that the encounters were now something that the players had to engage with on their own. And while they could gather information about them from others in the community, they were not necessarily easy to discover, and they actually had to engage with the monster to find out what its abilities were. It really helped to make the game more challenging, more interesting. And although a lot of players did still have information, they felt frustrated because they had done all this research, I would allow for their discovery of that information to be based on what would later evolve into attribute checks, which we'll talk about later. Now, when we talk about the process of character building, we talked earlier about run what you brung. Well, as time went by, characters became more attuned with what the player wanted. You had material like the fighter's guide or complete rogue's guide or whatever that were provided to allow role-playing inept to become better associated with role-play by giving them more options for what to define themselves as. And Dungeons and Dragons also methodically was going through and rapidly crisscrossing the lines, taking characters that were, for example, had no healing capabilities, suddenly could have a holy version. Or if they were a rogue, suddenly they could have an arcane version. And the idea is that there was a shift towards selfishness in determining what the players wanted to be, not in terms of making the class changes, which would have been arguably logical, that there was no longer any class and instead you just picked up these abilities. Instead, what they did is they said, no, you got to stay within your class, but you can take on those extra abilities by taking on these alternate character sheets, character concepts. And this was fomented hugely by the D20 period, because with the open gaming license, a lot of manufacturers and publishers could come up with new interpretations that would help fill those gaps in particular and provide the players with that information. And I call this a shift to selfishness because you're now not really any longer playing the character as what was written, but you were modifying the numbers from the get-go so that the player character was exactly the character that you wished to play. And that was ultimately, I think, a detriment to the playing community because they were no longer learning to expand their parameters into appreciating and understanding the other classes, but instead they were isolating down to their own preferences. This also tied into the concept of modification. With the advent of the feats rules in Dungeons & Dragons 3.0, 3.5, you see a shift not in focus, but now a change in trajectory. And optimizers started to step in. And when I use the term optimizer, I'm using a nice term. At the time, other game masters, and myself included, considered them to be min-maxers. They were looking for the edge, the gap in the rule system that would allow them to do something that they had not been able to do otherwise. And this move to modification also, ironically, made combat more difficult. Not that it made the system more difficult, but what it did do is it made the number modification process a lot more mentally a feature of gymnastics. You had to think on your feet, so to speak. And I believe Dungeons and Dragons, especially in that third edition, really tried to move the mechanism away from an arcane into a much more simplistic fashion. Their intent to make it easier for people to break into the game. The downside is that it started to stereotype. It's not a surprise that the number one class among all player characters across all Dungeons and Dragons has been the human fighter, and the rules mechanisms have made that more accommodating over time by changing the way modifiers work and also reversing the combat chart to make it match. So therefore, unlike the more arcane THACO, or less widely known, but 2-hit armor class 0. When that process is removed and instead you put back a simplified linear hit point track or an armor track, you then have now made the game slower by mechanism, because now the hit point pool becomes paramount, and we've done videos about that before, so I'm not going to go into that. But the point here is that character modification now is front loaded, so a new player has to go through all of those permutations before they can actually choose what class they want to play. And to me, that feels rather problematic. One of the reasons why Nykos has a simplified mechanism is simply to drive past this and get back to the part where the game is fun. Alrighty, so also need to talk about the idea of iteration versus recreation. And I'm not referring to recreation as in having fun. We're all trying to have fun. But the stories that you tell themselves are singular occurrences. Most people would buy a module or an adventure and play through it once and then be done, because all of their players have already been through it. Now, with a world that I had, moving as often as I did and restarting campaigns over and over again, meant that I got a chance to do additional iterations of the same adventure because the players had all changed. And I think the element of this that I really want to focus on is that when you have GM'd for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, you have you have an extended cadre library of possibilities, like this mythical one that I'm in here. But the idea is you've got all these different adventures that could be played. And to reiterate really would just mean that you'd be able to play through using the same mechanisms, the same NPCs, the stuff that you've become familiar with as a storyteller. Only the players themselves have altered and changed, and so they aren't experiencing them in the same way. And this opportunity allows you to see changes in the game system session after session, even in the same mechanistic location. Now, some would argue that this is not as creative. You're not being innovative. You're not recreating. But the reality is that the very process of integration is by nature a recreation. You're still creating something new and different, something innovative within that space by changing up the way those NPCs operate, what their reactions are to players, and all of that. And this process did lend itself to the world of Nykos, hence we are operating now in the 9th iteration of the campaign that I wrote so long ago. Alrighty, so next thing to talk about is ATC. I was an air traffic controller for a bunch of years, coming from Air Force, and I have to say that air traffic control was a blessing to role play in my world, because one of the things that you learn is how to compartmentalize and identify and weave different patterns together so that players can have different trajectories on where they want to go in their futures. And by having a singular mechanism, you're giving them the opportunity to move forward collectively as you line those vectors so they all end up at the same location in the future. And this also was a major factor in development of my personality. And those of you that knew me before, which is a while ago, this is pre-1980s, I was already fairly confident in my capacities, but once I became an air traffic controller, controllers by definition are compared to generals. There's nothing like God on earth but a general on his battlefield and an air traffic controller in position. The idea is that you have to be supremely confident that the decisions that you're making are the right ones, and having that awareness and acuity when running a roleplay game, you're able to help the players find the course they want to get to through the chaos. And by having that capability, provide the means for me to be able to run multiple games group in the same world at the same time, intersecting through different various locations. Now, the next thing we need to talk about, and this is actually my concluding episode scene, and that is the idea that your naming conventions need to be solid so that your players can be helped out when they need to build a new character name, when you are discovering a new location, perhaps you haven't mapped before, or whatever, to be able to come up with those kind of names. So with all of this, I want to thank you for being here. I've been here a little bit overstaying my welcome. So I want to thank you for being here, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Let me know, what questions should I be asking? What other parts of the history of my worlds and the game mechanism would you like to see? What pieces work best in your games? Hope to see you next time. I'm Jonathan Albin.